This is just a short presentation on the significance of Dante's Divine Comedy. When I introduced Dante's Divine Comedy to you, I told you that it's a pretty influential book, pretty significant book. One of the areas in which Dante's Divine Comedy has been very influential is in the part that we skipped over, and that is all those stories of all the people that Dante meets, the stories they have to tell about their lives, the decisions they made in their lives, and those kinds of things. Well, we had to skip over that to save time, and really didn't need to go into all those little stories. But very soon after Dante's death, authors began to take those little stories and expand on them, use them as the plot lines of their own novels or screenplays or movie scripts or whatever. And so that has been influential. In a literature course, you'd be reading Dante's Divine Comedy, and then you'd be reading maybe some of the other stories which are based on those little stories within the Divine Comedy. You would recognize them as the plot lines of novels you've read and TV shows you've seen and so on. So that's one area in which Dante's Divine Comedy is significant. It's also a source of information about popular culture in the High Middle Ages. What are people talking about? For example, there's a lot of criticism of the church in the Divine Comedy. A lot of criticism about political corruption, financial corruption. While Dante travels through hell, he meets 7 popes. Not the kind of people you expect to meet in hell. And Dante and Virgil walk along and they say, oh, wait a second, that he was one of the popes. And the pope would say, yeah, but you didn't know I was a crook. I was just in it for the money, to get money for my family. Pretty harsh criticism. And I'd have to say pretty well-deserved criticism, too. By the time of the High Middle Ages, the church has developed an awful lot of problems. That's one of the rules of the way the world works. The longer an organization is around, the longer it has time to accumulate problems. And by this time period, by the High Middle Ages, by the 13th century, the church has a bunch of problems. It's a pretty dysfunctional operation. It's not going to last very long. To give you a heads up about where we're going, it's not going to last very long. It's a good source of information about the history of science, especially in astronomy. As Dante and Beatrice travel through heaven, Dante tells her about different books. He's trying to show off to her, of course, you see. He tells her about different books that he's read about the moon and what the moon is made out of, how the moon moves, and those kind of scientific theories. A lot of those scientific theories from the 1200s, long since been discarded, and in fact, a lot of them we wouldn't know anything at all about if it weren't for Dante's Divine Comedy. One thing that I'm very embarrassed to say comes as a surprise to an awful lot of students is that Dante portrays the Earth as round. This is a couple hundred years before Columbus. In fact, in that textbook photograph that you have, you see that Dante portrays the Earth as round. Up here you see, whoa, where did my little thing go? Up here you see the circular, the circular layers of above the Earth. This painting is painted before Columbus. It's a big misconception. And you may even have been told it by a teacher sometime, that before Columbus, everybody thought the Earth was flat. But then Columbus tried to sail to China, bumped into the Americas, and everybody went, oh, wait a second, the Earth is round. That's a big misconception. Everybody before Columbus knew the Earth was round. If they thought about it, they knew the Earth was round. Aristotle had, I think it's 8 different proofs of the sphericity of the Earth, that the Earth is round. Columbus has nothing to do with the roundness of the Earth. Everybody before Columbus knew the Earth was round. The big deal with Columbus is, everybody knew that if you sailed to the west from Europe, you'd get to China, if the Americas weren't in the way. The big problem was getting back home. Columbus used his knowledge of wind currents in the northern hemisphere to figure out that you could sail to the west, get to China, if the Americas weren't in the way, and then you'd sail north, and then you drift down to get back home. That's the big deal with Columbus. It has nothing to do with the roundness of the Earth. That's a whole other lecture about where that misconception comes from. It's an intentional misconception. It was hatched in the 19th century. That's a whole other lecture to go into. But anyway, we learned that Dante sees the Earth as round. Well, everybody else in his time did too. Probably for us in this course, the most significant thing about Dante's Divine Comedy is that it's the first book written in this part of the world now. It's the first book written in this part of the world after the fall of Rome in a language that's not Latin. It's not written in Latin. Instead, it's written in the Italian language. What Dante does is something so obvious when somebody else sees it, something so simple when somebody else figures it out. You see, during those dark ages, reading and writing died out in Western Europe. Those Irish monks kept reading and writing alive. But what they kept in the Latin language, alive. But what they kept alive was reading and writing Latin. Meanwhile, all through those dark ages, Latin is becoming Italian and Spanish and French and Portuguese and Romanian and a bunch of others I'm leaving out, became all these different languages because it didn't have writing to keep it the same. When Alcuin and those Irish monks bring writing back to Western Europe, what they bring is writing in the Latin language. So in other words, in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to learn how to read, first of all you had to learn to speak Latin. And then once you learned how to speak Latin, then you could learn how to read and write in Latin. What Dante does is so obvious once somebody else thinks of it. He uses the letters of the Latin alphabet, the Roman alphabet, to sound out the Italian language. And he writes a book that anybody who speaks Italian can learn how to read. You spend a couple of afternoons learning a couple dozen letters, and then you start with the first word on the page, and you slowly sound that out until you figure out what that word is, and you keep moving through the words, and by the time you reach the 10th or 11th page, you taught yourself how to read. It's going to make literacy a lot more accessible to a lot more people, this move of writing in a common, ordinary language. That's because you don't have to learn Latin first. That's why the words in your textbook are English words. And that's probably the most significant thing about Dante's Divine Comedy, that this move towards writing in a common language is going to make literacy a lot more accessible to a lot more people.